I'm Roland Oliphant, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we report on Russia's use of a new intermediate-range ballistic missile and Vladimir Putin's threat to attack the United States and Britain in revenge for their assistance to Ukraine on the battlefield.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, 2 years and 277 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell, our Russia correspondent, James Kilner, and the Director of Military Science at the Royal United Services Institute, Matthew Savill. I started by asking James Kilner to bring us up to date with what we know about this dramatic missile launch.
Hi, Roland. Yeah, it's been an incredibly busy week, as you know, on the desk, covering all the missile news from Ukraine and Russia. So Putin finally popped up about 5:30, I think it was UK time, with a video response to these Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles, British, French, US-made missiles that Ukraine has been firing into Russia for the first time after Joe Biden gave them permission at the start of the week. He hadn't actually made a public statement on these attacks earlier in the week. He had signed into law a lowering of the Russia's nuclear doctrine threshold to cover an attack with conventional missiles, which is a change from the previous doctrine. He did do that on Tuesday, but he hadn't actually made any direct statements. We got one last night. He put out a 7.5-minute video. He looked very tired and very drawn, I have to say, unusually so in this video. But it was a long video, and it was all about Russia's response to these US, French, British missiles flying into Russia. The response, as he was saying, was this new intermediate range missile called the Oresnik, which is a Russian word for hazelnuts. This hadn't been on anyone's radar before. This is apparently a new missile developed in relative secrecy in Russia. The Ukrainian intelligence, some Western intelligence as well, had been supposing that the Kremlin had fired an intercontinental ballistic missile called the RS-26 at Dnipro around dawn or yesterday morning. But Putin popped up and he confirmed that it was this missile, the Oresnik. What we do know about this missile, what some experts who have some details on it have been saying, is that this is some sort of experimental hybrid missile which sits somewhere in between intercontinental intermediate range missiles. It's nuclear capable. It wasn't carrying nuclear warhead when it was fired in Dnipro. But Putin very much made the point in his video that this is a nuclear-capable missile. This is an extremely fast missile. He said it flies at Mach 10 times the speed of sound. And he also boasted that it couldn't be shot down by Western anti-missile defense systems. Who really knows? But this is what he was saying. And his whole point, the whole premise of this long-winded video response was a very strong warning and message to Britain and to America especially. He basically said, reading between the lines, I've unveiled this missile system, I've tested it in Ukraine now, but it's really designed for a strike in Europe. It has, we think, a range of about 3,000 miles, so easily enough to strike anywhere in Europe. And it seems to have been specifically designed with that in mind. The Ukrainian intelligence says it's been test fired a couple of times, once in October last year and once in June this year. And then this was its first unveiling in a combat scenario. So I very much ramping up the ante. He even, quote, said in his video, I recommend the ruling elites of these countries, i.e. America and Britain, that are hatching plans to use their military contingents against Russia, seriously think again. So very chilling statement there from the Russian leader, backed up by the use of this new missile.
James, thank you very much for that. We will be discussing this whole question of missiles and deterrence and the massive box of worms it opens up with Matthew Savill shortly. Before we get to that really meaty discussion, I'm just going to go through the other military updates. So just to bring you up to speed with developments on the battlefield, starting as we generally do up in Kursk, at the kind of 12 o'clock point of the most northerly point of the current active front line. Now, we have some reports that Russian forces have recently marginally advanced on that main Ukrainian salient there, somewhere southeast of the village of Sudzha. Quite difficult to confirm exactly who holds what at the moment, but we do know that the Russians have, well, we're told they've massed a force of somewhere in the region of 50,000 men, including North Koreans, with the intention of crushing that salient in the next few months. The other interesting development out of Kursk is, this is from Western officials, briefing. I think it was first the Wall Street Journal ran with this, but it's going around. So Western officials have briefed that a senior North Korean general was wounded in a recent Ukrainian strike in Kursk region. They didn't disclose how the senior North Korean officer was wounded or his identity, but this seems likely that it's connected to Wednesday's Storm Shadow strike on a Russian command post in the village of Marino, which is a village in the Kursk region. That was that high-profile first use of storm shadows in Russia that Vladimir Putin said he was responding to with the missile strike we're just talking about. And it was believed, it was reported at the time, that the Russian and North Korean officers were supposed to be present there. So that's all we know at the moment. We do know that Pyongyang, or we believe that North Korea's commander in Russia overseeing that effort is one Colonel General Kim Yong-buk, but we don't know if it's him who's been wounded or somebody else. Moving into Ukraine itself, so this morning, shortly before we came on air, Russia's Defense Minister Andrei Belousov said that Russian forces have accelerated their advance in northeast Ukraine and have ground down the Ukrainian army's best units. I'm not immediately able to confirm that whether he's referring to some specific event that's happened over the past 24 hours. But this is what we can say, and I'll get my sourcing out of the way. I'm mostly relying here on the Center for Defense Strategies, a Ukrainian defense think tank, and the collation of news that comes from the Center for the Study of War in Washington. So we understand Russian forces are reported to have mounted unsuccessful attacks from the lodgements in the north of the Kharkiv region around Chansk and so on. On the eastern front in Kharkiv, around Kupiansk, Russia continues to press on the Ukrainian bridgehead on the east bank of the Oskil River, which is, you will have noticed, they succeeded in cutting that in two some weeks ago. So the Russians have reached the Oskil River. Those two parts of the bridgehead, the northern part is the one that Kupiansk city is in. And you can see what the Russians are trying to do there. They're trying to isolate, they're trying to edge forward. Advances so far, or in the past kind of 24, 48 hours, not very significant, but that's what's going on there. Further south along the same front line, there is geolocated footage posted yesterday on November the 21st that shows the Russians have recently advanced in the town of Terny, that's northwest of Kremina. And that is just a little bit further south from Kupiansk on that kind of north to south front line, running down towards Bas. And we understand from the Center for Defense Strategies that's roughly the area where Russia is putting in its main effort on that segment on the front. Further south, moving down into Donetsk region, Russian airstrikes reported near Siversk, Chasiv Yar, Lipivka. The Russians have made recent advances southeast of Chasiv Yar. Little progress towards the city itself. The battle there still seems fairly static. In Toretsk, further south still, now the Center for Defense Strategies reports 7 Russian attempts to gain ground there, supported by aviation yesterday. That was as of 7 o'clock last night. The ISW reports confirmed gains in central Toretsk, and there have been some Russian sources actually claiming that they now control 50% of Toretsk. But I must say, as far as the battle there in the city is very confused, and as far as we can understand, the Russians may have taken ground, but it still seems to be a very intense urban fighting, well, in what is left of the urban area, somewhere in the center of the built-up area of Toretsk. The main effort remains, as it has done for weeks and months now, down in that southeastern corner of the front around Pokrovsk and the town of Korakova, which is now right down in the corner of the front. The Russians have been putting in multiple efforts there. It looks like, I won't bore you with all the details, but this is the Center for Defense Strategies. It looks like Russian forces are trying to cut the Ukrainian logistics route between Velika Novosilk and Kurakova, and that is going to essentially threaten with encirclement those Ukrainian troops right down in the corner. The Ukrainian troops still hold this. you could call it a bridgehead. I mean, it's almost a semi-encircled little bit of land. It's only about 6 by 10 kilometers across to the kind of south and east of Korakova. They're probably going to have to abandon that soon, one would imagine. And the CDS is saying that retreat is probably going to happen before the end of November. And they also predict that Ukraine is going to have to retreat from the northern bank of the Korakova Reservoir to avoid an encirclement there. After that, they anticipate the Russians will start focusing on seizing Velika Novosilka, which is the next kind of big town along to the west, along the front line. They're predicting that might occur in January. So that's their kind of projection of the timeline for that kind of thing. Not much change further west along the front. Zaporizhia, Kherson remains fairly static. In terms of the air war, Ukraine's parliament in Kyiv has cancelled a session today after the ballistic missile attack in Dnipro, apparently in response to that. Not clear if that's in response to specific intelligence of a new threat or just a precaution, but with several Ukrainian MPs have been posting videos of themselves outside the Rada in central Kyiv saying, I was going to come to work today, we were meant to have a session, but it's been cancelled because of the Russians. Also, the Russians struck Sumy with Shaheds overnight, killing 2 people and injuring 12. The significance here, the regional governor says that these Shaheds were stuffed with shrapnel, and he says it's the first time that's been seen. So anti-personnel Shaheds stuffed with shrapnel designed to kill people, basically, to damage humans, not to damage infrastructure. That is more or less the scene on the battlefield today, this afternoon. James Rothwell, could I bring you in here? I know you've been looking at the diplomatic developments. You're in Berlin, I know, and I wonder if you want to start in Berlin, because there has been an interesting, fairly significant diplomatic development there.
Yes, that's right, Roland, and thanks for having me back on the podcast. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, last night announced that he won't be running for the leadership of the SPD. That's the centre-left party currently led by Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany. And this is a really significant development in German politics ahead of the snap elections that are due to be held early in the new year in February. Why? Boris Pistorius has been discussed. His name has been circulating in Berlin for many, many weeks as a really popular and really strong potential candidate to oust Mr. Scholz and to lead the SPD into those elections. But last night he ruled it out completely. He said, "This is my sovereign personal decision and only my decision, brackets, not to stand." I've emphasized this over and over in recent weeks, and I'm saying it again as clearly as possible. In Olaf Scholz, we have an excellent chancellor. That is Mr. Pistorius trying to, I think, quell a rebellion in the SPD, because we've had lots of stories come out over the last few weeks which suggested that some figures in the SPD wanted to do a sort of Biden move ahead of the German election, where they get rid of Mr. Scholz and they bring in a new energetic figure, Mr. Pistorius, and that might improve their chances of winning the election. Now, why are we talking about this on the Ukraine podcast? Firstly, it's because Boris Pistorius has always been a bit more hawkish on Ukraine, by German standards at least. And that means that had he become the leader of the SPD, which, as I've said, it now seems extremely unlikely, but had he become the leader of the SPD, he might have changed its Ukraine policy going into the February elections. He might even have outlined a Ukraine policy that would have more in common with the CDU here in Germany, which is much more supportive of Ukraine. Their leader, Friedrich Merz, for example, has basically said that if he becomes the next chancellor, he will give an ultimatum to Vladimir Putin, where if Putin refuses to stop bombing civilians, Germany will send Taurus missiles. Because Mr. Pistorius has got this reputation for being more supportive for Ukraine, he's spoken much more starkly about the threat from Russia. He has said, for example, that Germany may have to fight a war with Russia in just a couple of years. There had been hopes that if he became the party leader and not Mr. Scholz, that would potentially put Germany in a stronger position going forward for supporting Ukraine. That's because, by the way, even though Mr. Scholz's SPD is projected to perform very poorly in the elections in February, German politics is, of course, dominated by coalition building, and there remains a possibility that even if they do really badly in this election, so if they come in second place or even in third place, as the polls suggest they will, there remains a possibility of them being a junior partner in the coalition. So it's an internal development, really, Roland, in Germany, German politics, but it does have ramifications for Ukraine, because those who were hoping to see perhaps Mr. Pistorius take over the SPD from Mr. Scholz and put someone who's more pro-Ukraine into that position, they will no doubt have been very disappointed by the announcement last night that he's definitely not going to do it.
Could I just very quickly on that practical question, in terms of the Taurus missiles, is there any sign that we think Scholz is going to be around for a while? Is there any sign of him shifting on Taurus since the Americans and the Brits gave permission for ATACMS and Storm Shadows to be sent into Russia, or is he sticking to his guns on that? Do we think Taurus just is not going to move?
He's sticking to his guns. He's reiterated his position that he doesn't want to send Taurus missiles. I will put forward sort of part of the argument that you sometimes hear in Germany about Taurus missiles and let listeners draw their own conclusions from this. When I've discussed the issue of Taurus missiles with German government officials in the past, they argue that it is sometimes unfair to draw equivalence between the German Taurus and other missiles that other countries might be sending, because they say the Taurus is like a really very, very long-range weapon that could be used potentially to basically blow up the Kremlin. And fears have been expressed in the past that if Taurus missiles were given to Ukraine, that they might use it to blow up the Kremlin. Now, the other side of the argument, of course, is that we know that Ukraine is very careful about what it does with the weapons that it gives, and there seems to be multiple stages of approval when it's using these weapons. For example, that very long-running debate about what Ukraine is allowed to use to strike deep inside Russian territory. So there's a lot of skepticism about that idea. I just want to put it out there because that is part of the German government perspective.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to move on to another German-ish story about Nord Stream. Have you been looking at this?
Yep, that's right. On the Nord Stream area, the Washington Post is reporting that an American businessman with links to the Kremlin is basically trying to lay the groundwork for reactivating the Nord Stream pipeline. The Washington Post reports that Stephen Lynch, a businessman who previously worked with the Kremlin state oil champion Rosneft, is trying to get hold of or acquire the Swiss-based operating company that controls Russia's Nord Stream 2. As you know, Roland, Nord Stream 2 was sanctioned by the US after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it was severely damaged by underwater explosions back in August 2022. If there were to be a ceasefire, it seems, based on the Washington Post reporting, that what this businessman, Stephen Lynch, is trying to do is lay the groundwork for that pipeline to come back in the event of a ceasefire. So that's the other development that's Germany adjacent, because, of course, the Nord Stream pipeline was connecting Russia and Germany.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask you about one other thing. I think it's leading on the BBC. I mean, to be fair to them, largely because I think it's their scoop. Not that it's not a good story, but it feeds back into this whole question of storm shadows of North Koreans in Russia, of escalation. And it's about, I believe it's about what Russia might have given North Korea in exchange for sending troops and weapons for the war effort.
That's right. So Jean McKenzie, the BBC's sole correspondent, is reporting that in effect, and by the way, this story has been done in tandem with the Open Source Centre, which I'm told is a non-profit research group in the UK, is reporting that more than 1 million barrels of oil have been transported by Russia to North Korea. That is in breach of UN sanctions, which ban countries from giving large quantities of oil to North Korea. You can do it in small quantities. And the whole reason that those sanctions are in place, as you know, Roland, is to prevent North Korea from further developing its nuclear weapons. So it's a really interesting story from the BBC because it shows what the quid pro quo is between Russia and North Korea. It sounds like the oil that Russia has given to North Korea is basically payment for the weapons and troops that Pyongyang sent to Moscow to support the war in Ukraine. And the sourcing on this from the BBC is pretty good. It's based on, as I said, satellite imagery from Open Source Centre, but they've also independently confirmed it, they say, with leading experts and the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
Thank you, James, for those very important and comprehensive overviews of the diplomatic landscape. Now, our assistant comment editor, Francis Durnley, and Dominic Nichols, our associate defence editor, are currently on assignment in Ukraine. They've been unable to join us live for the Twitter space, but Francis had sent us this audio dispatch about what they're seeing on the road.
Well, greetings from a rather snowy Ukraine. This is going to be a little bit of a brief dispatch because we've been very busy, almost back to back in interviews in the last 48 hours or so. But I wanted to offer just a few reflections on some of those conversations and the general mood here. I can imagine that in the last few days, a lot of the headlines in the West have been extremely dramatic in nature, given the usage of intercontinental missiles and, of course, the granting of permissions on Storm Shadows and ATACMS. But if you're expecting that to be reflected here with more panic, I would say that that is quite far off the mark. Yes, when we were having conversations a couple of days ago, when the air raid siren went off, then a lot of people did go into the shelters at a speed that perhaps would not have been normal were it not for the rather unique situation. And yet, very quickly, they said that they'd seen reports that this was just psychodrama, the normal psychodrama from Russia, and therefore they weren't alarmed, they weren't panicked, and very quickly, within about 20 minutes or so, we're back outside and life was carrying on as normal in Kyiv. And that's the thing I would really stress, is that in Kyiv, the life goes on. Cars are driving the streets, people are living their lives. This is not somewhere that is bunkered down, expecting some kind of weapon to drop on them at any minute. But in one rather humorous conversation that I had with somebody, they said, "You must feel greatly honoured to be in Ukraine and the first time in history that an intercontinental missile is fired." And so it just gives you a sense of the black humour here at the moment. Another thing that this individual said to me was, well, now we know they had 26 intercontinental missiles, now they've only got 24. So there's a blitz spirit, if I can articulate it in that way, here in Ukraine at the moment. But, and I should caveat that by saying that whilst I do speak to some people, ordinary people mostly, who say that from their perspective they want to fight on, that are quite dismissive of the idea of negotiations, there are others, particularly politicians, who put forward a point of view that are more sympathetic to the idea of there being some kind of talks taking place. That's MPs that I've spoken to publicly and privately. Some of those interviews you'll hear in subsequent days. Yesterday, of course, was Alexander, who offered the perspective of an MP who did not feel that the time was right for negotiations, but I don't necessarily feel that that was typical. I think that there is a sense of some people being more open to the idea than perhaps they would have 7 months ago. So I think if I were to sum up just very briefly, as I say, some reactions here, it is that Western commentary on the situation feels quite foreign and disconnected from the reality on the ground, at least as far as ordinary people are concerned. This is not the beginning of World War III, as you might have read in the headlines. Rather, this is just the expectation when it comes to Russia responding to any kind of development, is the new normal hyperbole of using nuclear weapons, but people have become very used to that here in Ukraine and know that it's really nonsense. I have been watching, like last time, so Ukrainian television, but I'm going to save that and offer you my perspectives on what I was watching in terms of the soaps and themes of the subjects on the news, etc., etc. But for now, I will just leave you with the thoughts of a rather optimistic city at the moment that I'm in, and a sense of life going on. That's all from us for now in Ukraine. See you next week.
I would like to turn now. I'm very pleased to say that we're being joined by Matthew Savill, who is the Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute, and someone who spends probably more time than most of us thinking about things like the difference between intermediate and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Thank you so much for joining us at such short notice. We really, really appreciate it. You've been sitting there listening patiently to all this news we're reporting about all this. A lot has developed since we learnt the first reports yesterday from the Ukrainians. They'd been hit by an ICBM. Now it's just being played down. Apparently it's not actually an ICBM. Can we start with just the physics, the objective three-dimensional realities that exist in space, if you see what I mean? What do we know about it?
Well, I think the first thing I should say is you've given me far too much credit. What actually happens is it's the mega brains of my team who do most of the hard thinking, and then I attempt to somehow paraphrase what they've done and make it sound intelligent. So apologies to them in advance and counter-proliferation experts if I'm about to mangle it. We know relatively little out in the real world about this missile, but it seems that governments in the US and the UK might have a bit more insight and have been looking at this for a while. And there is a fair amount of knowledge on the missile upon which it is based, which is something called the RS-26, which was a missile that was in development for quite some time. It was classified as an intercontinental ballistic missile, which means it has a range of greater than 5,500 kilometers. But when it was being developed and tested, there was a lot of skepticism about whether or not it was actually a slightly shorter range missile designed to carry a heavier payload, and was being called an ICBM rather than an intermediate range one, i.e. under 5,500 kilometers, because the Russians were trying to sneak around the limitations of a treaty that existed called the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is a Cold War treaty designed to basically eliminate all ground-based missiles with a range of between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So basically, you have Tomahawks and they're launched from ships or submarines, but land-based missiles with this sort of covering this huge range were wiped out. And people thought the RS-26 was an attempt to sneak round that. So people know quite a lot about the RS-26.
Thank you very much. And that, even just that, raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? It raises questions along the lines of why those things were banned and what it means now that they're back in play. Before we get to that, could I just ask you, from what we know about the strike, and I've just got a few extra details. We heard James Kilner's update just there, but I've got a few extra details I just spotted from Ukrainian military intelligence. They say that it was fired from the Astrakhan region to the city of Dnipro. I don't honestly have an as the crow flies kind of distance there, but he says it took 15 minutes to fly there. It was carrying 6 warheads. Each warhead is equipped with 6 sub-munitions. Would that make 36 sub-munitions, if I'm right?
Yep.
And the final speed of trajectory is at Mach 11. Given all that, and what you've just said about it, could you lay out, I mean, there's military significance and political significance. Could you start with the military?
Yes. And if we had to guess, the internet sleuths and people who are adept at using commercial satellite imagery will be trying to narrow down, go back over pictures and see exactly where it came from. I think if we had to guess, we would say the facility at Kapustin Yar, which is just over 800 kilometers from Dnipro, because that's where RS-26 was tested a number of times. The interesting thing is the project was theoretically paused about 2017. Shashank Joshi, eagle-eyed person that he is, spotted that the recent Defense Intelligence Agency update on these issues talked about it as being delayed, which might be a sign that they had picked up this resurrection. The military utility or the military impact, I hesitate to say anybody launching an intermediate range missile is limited, but because of what I'm going to say about the political impact, I think it's relatively speaking limited, because something like this is largely speaking designed to be nuclear armed. You can conventionally arm it, but it would normally be nuclear armed. And that means there are bigger variations in its accuracy than you get with much shorter range missiles, or what the Russians have with something like their cruise missiles, so the Kinzhal or the Zircon, KH-101, all of those sort of things. And that doesn't matter when you are lobbing nuclear warheads at people. But it does matter if you're trying to hit a building in particular with one of these. And so you can get pretty good accuracy, but there's still a reasonable chance you'll miss a specific building. And so there are a lot more, well, there's a larger range of other weapons the Russians could and would use to strike things. And this doesn't help them hugely in that regard, and they probably don't have that many. And that bounces us on to, I mean, I can pause, but why it feels like this is much more about political signalling.
Okay, so what you're saying is, in terms of military utility on the battlefield in Ukraine, there's lots of other weapons that could do this job of hitting Yuzhmash or whatever it was in Dnipro much more accurately and much more cheaply than this thing. Therefore, this is probably a largely political message.
Yes, and there's a little bit of signalling to the Ukrainians here. We've got a whole separate class of missiles that we can fire at you from way outside the range of things like ATACMS and Storm Shadow. This is where this debate to non-specialists begins to sound a bit bizarre. We spend all of this time talking about deep strike and longer range missiles like Storm Shadow, and then suddenly we're in a whole different game here. So Storm Shadow the range in public is only ever described as more than 250 kilometers. ATACMS is a small ballistic missile, and it goes up to 300 kilometers, and they need to get these long ranges. Now we're talking about missiles with a range of 5,500 kilometers. So they can sit these well back and basically laugh at any attempt to hit the launchers with something like ATACMS or Storm Shadow. But that's not really the key audience. I think the key audience is international backers who are being warned that the Russians are prepared to play around with using missiles that would normally be nuclear tipped. And incidentally, in this case, what they did was, it sounds like, follow the procedures for notification around an ICBM, which is that they told the US that they were going to launch it. That contributed potentially to US alarm. So they're basically entering the game with a whole other class of missiles. It also goes to the heart of a capability gap that most of Europe has, which is we don't have any missiles ground-based of this type or anything anywhere near it, partly because we didn't enter into that game fundamentally. And there is therefore a not that subtle warning to Europe that the Russians have got more cards to play.
I won't editorialize. I was about to say that's scary stuff, but it just sounds like a waste of airtime. I've already wasted it now. I think people could judge that for themselves. I wanted to ask you, given all that, I don't know if you listened to or watched or read the address Vladimir Putin gave last night on television, in which he was very explicit, I thought. I watched the whole thing from beginning to end, and I thought, if I was to take the varnish off this, it's pretty blunt. It says, I've raised the stakes. I will hit you, possibly, if you continue to authorize these Storm Shadows and ATACMS strikes. And he very bluntly threatened he said he reserved the right to hit the countries supplying Ukraine as well, which means Britain and the United States, which sounds nuts. I'm just wondering, what do you make of that speech and those threats? Because if you were to take it at face value, you might think he's threatening to start the Third World War. Or is there something more subtle going on here?
I'm not sure if there's anything more subtle going on here. And one of the things to bear in mind is that in spite of all of that messaging, and I do think it is important to not be glib about threats from a nuclear armed state, we would probably be well advised not to take the counsel of our worst fears, which is that some of that updating of their nuclear doctrine, for example, was basically writing down things that they have said anyway. Some of it's quite obvious, extending protection to Belarus, where they have stationed weapons, but some of it's not that credible. There is significant doubt as to whether they would genuinely launch a nuclear strike on a NATO country if the Ukrainians, for example, threatened Crimea. The Ukrainians have entered Russia and carved out a chunk of territory. Now that's not going brilliantly at the moment, but there has not been a nuclear response. The Russians, when people say the Russians don't respond and they don't escalate, that's not true. They have escalated throughout this conflict, but they have done so by conventionally striking the Ukrainians and hitting civilian targets and civilian infrastructure. And then we've got this issue of a sabotage campaign and subversion and disruption that people do need to take seriously and are taking seriously. But the conventional backwards and forwards of the campaign has actually probably been priced into the Russian response already. We've seen that from how they have acted. So a lot of this, I think, is playing on the expressed fears or the limitations in support that have been exposed by some of the, I would suggest, frankly, unhelpful public debate over things like ATACMS and Storm Shadow, which fundamentally should have stayed private and then resulted in something happening and then being briefed after the event. And I know there are some people who argue, like, no, that should have been subject to parliamentary debate. I think that would genuinely have been difficult without doing what has happened, which is they've sold the pass.
Okay, then. So how... Well, I suppose there's always two parts to the next question. One is, how should Ukrainian or Western policymakers respond? I suppose Western policymakers, because I think it's largely aimed at them. But then there's a question of how they will, or how you anticipate they will actually respond and handle this.
I mean, that's a great question, a great pair of questions, which I'm going to wildly equivocate on, partly because, of course, the former civil servant never leaves me, and partly because it's a bit presumptuous of me to say what they should do. And I think one of the things that sits in the background here, whilst there's been a lot of criticism of the US stance, is their not unreasonable point that they bear all of the risk if escalation gets out of control, because they're the people who are going to buy out European security risk with their nuclear or conventional umbrella. So I do bear that in mind. I think the answer is, it looks like most international backers will continue doing what they're currently doing. And that means the US will try and accelerate getting in support and materiel while there is a window of opportunity before the new EU administration comes in. And the Ukrainians will continue to use ATACMS and Storm Shadow because they've been given approval to do so. It would be perverse to change that policy on the back of the first predictable-ish reaction from the Russians. But it also means that some aren't going to change their stance. I'm not a German politics expert, but it doesn't seem to me that Chancellor Scholz is going to change his position on Taurus anytime soon. So it looks like people are going to carry on, largely speaking, doing what they're doing, and the Ukrainians are going to carry on doing what they're doing. And what they really need to do at the moment is two things. They've got to fix their recruitment, mobilization, and training system. All the material in the world won't help them if there's nobody to use it. And then they've got to influence and shape the incoming US administration to say that it is worth giving them more time to try and address the current trajectory of the conflict, because at the moment that is working in the Russians' favor, regardless of how soon we then hit a negotiation point.
Can I ask you, in that case, because it seems to me that, as you said, it's quite a dramatic upping of the stakes. Suddenly, Vladimir Putin slams a 5,000 kilometer range missile on the table. It seems like a delicate and risky form of signaling or a way to talk to your geopolitical rivals. How dangerous a moment is this? Are we in a kind of Cuban Missile Crisis moment of brinksmanship, or is it something else entirely? Because it's definitely not business as usual, as far as I can tell.
It's not, but it's not actually happening in isolation, or rather, it's not just happening in the context of Ukraine. So we separately have had a debate in Europe since the INF treaty collapsed, which happened, I think it was 5 years ago. So the US and others accused the Russians. This was something that the first Trump administration did, but there was a lot of support for it, which is that they accused the Russians of developing weapons that breached INF, and RS-26 was one of them, but actually the key one was a different missile. And then they pulled out, the US pulled out, I think it was in 2018, 2019. And the Russians have said that they have no longer bound by it, but they are trying to claim that they're not developing these missiles, and indeed have recently again issued a statement saying, well, we could end our moratorium. So that debate over intermediate range missiles actually started several years ago. Europe knows it's got a gap. This is where lots of these deep strike and hypersonic missiles that are being discussed under the AUKUS deal, under various other places, play in. So the Russians would say, well, we're just responding to your threatening rhetoric, but actually this is developing. And then this year, the US said, we will begin in 2026, a couple of years away, episodic deployments of some of its long-range capabilities, like Tomahawk, like a ground-based version of Standard Missile 6, and those could go to Germany. And so what is happening, I don't think, is a Cuban Missile Crisis type event where you have the sudden and shocking appearance of an actual nuclear weapon on someone's doorstep where it's not supposed to be. What you have is this, if you like, slower burn capability race between Russia and others to fill in gaps, which in many cases is actually conventional. But the Russians are talking nuclear language because they want to, if you like, have escalation dominance. So it's not a complete symmetry of capabilities. A lot of these are meant to be conventional capabilities about conventional deterrence.
Are you, I might have got this wrong, but are you basically saying we're seeing the beginnings of an arms race, and that you talked about a gap there? Is Europe, Britain's got the Strategic Defence Review coming out in spring or something. So basically mean these intermediate range ground-based missiles, which had been banned for a long time, they're back on the table. We don't have many, and we're going to have to start building them.
Yes. I mean, is it an arms race? I guess somebody who's a proliferation expert would probably say yes. It is. I mean, if you can look at this across the board, if you look at the UK in particular, let's just nail down, the UK has next to no long-range deep strike stuff. I mean, that's a bit harsh, but what I mean is we have Tomahawk from a small number of submarines, and that goes 1,500 kilometers or something. And above that, we've got the nuclear deterrent Trident. And then all of a sudden, you go from that to Storm Shadow. That's the next longest range thing we have as an air-launched weapon with a range of, let's say, close to 300 kilometers. So that's a great example of how, in particular, us having massive conventional air superiority and not really thinking hard about trying to get through enemy air defenses means that we've got this really odd weapons mix where we haven't got lots of gradients we can go up. We've basically got nukes, some cruise missiles we bought from the US, and then some stuff that is much shorter range. We still mostly bomb targets. We're still in the process of developing a standoff missile that could go a couple of 100 kilometers. And many other people are in the same position and have begun slowly filling their inventories with a mixture of weapons from the US, like the JASSM or the JASSM-ER, extended range missile. Norwegians putting in the naval strike missile. Europe is beginning to fill this gap, but there is still this incredible properly deep strike gap. You look at the army, the longest range thing they've got at the moment is the multiple launch rocket system, 50 kilometers. We don't have anything like ATACMS. The Americans are developing a 1,000 kilometer replacement for their HIMARS called PRISM. Again, this is all, I'm ranging all over the place now, but this is such a source of angst in NATO militaries that there are any number of these programs underway in all environments.
Matthew, thanks very much. I realise I've been dominating the conversation. We're running out of time. So I want to ask James Rothwell, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Really interesting insight. I've got a question that might be out of your area of specialism, so feel free to pass on this one, but I would be interested in your view, Matthew. What's your perspective on China's role in this? They're obviously a close ally of North Korea, which is now deployed to fight in Ukraine. Do we know what their position is or is likely to be on the latest escalatory rhetoric by Vladimir Putin?
So the honest answer is I am not a real kind of deep China expert. I think they have come out already with a sort of general language of emollients of like escalation is not good, but they are, it seems, pretty relaxed about the way that this is going because they're able to keep their relationship running along with the Russians. They don't seem that fussed about the North Koreans turning up, and in the very long term this only makes the Russians more reliant upon the Chinese. I think one of the things that's interesting is a lot of people originally said the Russians won't, will have to pull back at some point or won't go in because of the damage this will do to them and what it would mean. I think they are thinking in the relatively near term, and they will cross that bridge when they come to it down the line in terms of what does that mean about their relationship with China, even if they're touchy about it. But in truth, I don't really know, because, of course, the key question that the real China experts will be looking at is, at what point do we think China will potentially up the ante in its support for Russia? There is already a debate going on about, have weapons gone or not? What weapons have gone? Are the drones weaponized, etc., etc.? And I think a lot of people are looking at that as we speak.
Matthew, thanks very much indeed. We are sadly running up against the clock. So without further ado, I'd like to go to final thoughts. James Rothwell, what would you like to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, just a brief final thought from me, Roland, on Taurus missiles. I think it's really unlikely that Olaf Scholz is going to change his position on this going into the German election. So all I would say to our listeners is don't expect a kind of 11th hour shift from the German Chancellor on Taurus missiles.
Thanks for that, James. Matthew Savill, as our guest, would you like the very final words?
Oh, well, I'm going to cheat and do two. One, very pleased to hear about that story about North Korean smuggling and the Open Source Center, because they are former colleagues from RUSI who set up their own team, and we've just done a joint report with them on Russian artillery production. So, read that, and great work by the OSC team. The second big point here is all of this debate around missiles, Storm Shadow, ATACMS, and IRBMs or not is important, but it is fundamentally partly a distraction from what is happening, particularly in the East, which is a battle of numbers and a challenge for Ukrainian training, recruitment and mobilization, which I'm a bit of a broken record on. And they need to find a way to address that challenge and then message the new US administration that they are still worth backing and Europe stepping up in backing them. Otherwise, all of this deep strike discussion will be a distraction from the very slow crumpling of Ukrainian front lines.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and to stay on top of all our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. And as ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter, executive producers Louisa Wells and David Knowles.